The gavel came down at 9:47 on a Tuesday morning in March of 1988, and the sound of it carried across the impound lot like a rifle shot in cold air. Nobody moved. Nobody raised a hand. The auctioneer looked out at the row of men in canvas jackets and feed store caps, and the row of men looked back at him, and the 14 machines sitting behind him in the mud said nothing at all. Nobody except one man. Harlan Briggs stood at the far left edge of the crowd, with his hands in the front pockets of a flannel shirt that had been washed so many times the red had faded to the color of old brick. He was 49 years old. He had 34 years of grease under his fingernails that no amount of lava soap ever quite reached. He had $6,200 in a savings account at First National Bank of Odessa, and he had driven 40 minutes in the dark that morning to stand in a government impound lot outside of town and look at 14 machines that every licensed dealer in the state of Texas had already walked away from. He raised his hand 12 more times before the morning was over. When it was done, he had spent $5,600. He owned 14 tractors that the federal government had declared legally unsellable to any licensed farm equipment dealer in the state. He had enough left over to buy fuel for the flatbed he had borrowed from his neighbor and a cup of coffee at the diner on the highway going back. He bought the coffee black. He did not celebrate. He drove home. You need to understand what West Texas looked like in the spring of 1988 before you can understand what Harlan was looking at in that lot. Because it was not just rust and flat tires and seized engines. It was the physical wreckage of the worst agricultural collapse the Southern Plains had seen since the Dust Bowl. Between 1984 and 1987, the Farm Credit System foreclosed on more than 12,000 properties in Texas alone. Farmers who had borrowed heavily through the 70s, encouraged by government policy, by land prices that seemed to only go up by promises of global grain demand that never fully materialized, had spent a decade carrying debt that made sense when interest rates were 6% and made no sense at all when the Federal Reserve pushed them past 20. Banks called notes. Equipment dealers closed. The county roads that had once seen a steady stream of green and red machinery going field to field went quiet in a way that felt permanent. When the banks and the government took the farms, they took everything. The land, the grain, the buildings, and the equipment. Especially the equipment. It sat in lots like the one outside Odessa. Government impound yards administered by county sheriffs and federal marshals who had no budget to maintain $40,000 machines and no interest in learning how. When the engines seized, when the diesel congealed in the lines, when the hydraulic seals dried and cracked, when the starter motors corroded to paste inside their housings, the appraisers just wrote down a lower number and scheduled another auction. Licensed dealers would not touch them. The liability was too high. You could not sell a machine with a locked engine to a farmer without disclosing it. And no one with a dealer's license wanted to take on a 1964 John Deere 4020 that had been sitting in a Texas impound yard for 3 years and promised the buyer it would run. But Harlan Briggs was not a licensed dealer. He was a mechanic. Had been since he was 15 years old, when his father put him to work in a corrugated steel shed outside Lubbock, rebuilding cotton pickers for farms that could not afford new ones. He never went past high school. He got his GED at 23. He married June Alderman at 25 in a Baptist church in Midland on a Saturday afternoon in October, when the temperature was still 91 degrees. And the preacher sweated through his collar before he finished the vows. He spent the 34 years after that at a John Deere dealership in Odessa, turning wrenches for $11.40 an hour, which the dealership considered a fair wage, and Harlan considered enough. They called him indispensable. They used that exact word at his 15-year review. and again at his 25-year review. And they said it one more time in December of 1987. In the same breath, they used to tell him they were letting him go. Cost reduction. Computerized diagnostic systems were coming into the industry. The future of equipment service management had decided was in software and trained technicians certified on the new platforms, not in men who could rebuild a diesel injection pump by feel in a dark shed at 11 o'clock at night. Harlan was 49 years old. He had 34 years of knowledge the industry had just decided it did not need anymore. He did not argue. He cleaned out his toolbox over 2 afternoons, loaded it into his truck, shook hands with 3 of the other mechanics, and drove home. June had been gone 3 years by then. Pancreatic cancer diagnosed in April of 1985, and she was gone by September of the same year. Fast enough that some mornings Harlan still woke up and forgot for a few seconds before the house reminded him. She had been the one who kept records. June kept everything. Grocery receipts in a shoebox under the kitchen counter. Vehicle maintenance logs in a manila folder in the second drawer of the filing cabinet. And notebooks. She always had a notebook. Wide-ruled, spiral-bound books that she used to track household expenses, seasonal schedules, the planting calendars of the farms they had, neighbors with observations about what was going on around them that she thought might matter later. There was one she had never opened, still in the plastic sleeve from the drugstore. It was sitting in the kitchen drawer under the phone book when Harlan came home the afternoon they let him go, and he stood in the kitchen in his coat and looked at that drawer for a long time. Then he opened it and took the notebook out. He spent 3 weeks after losing his job driving to every government impound lot within 200 miles of Odessa. Yards outside Andrews, outside Pecos, outside Big Spring and Midland, and one small lot east of La Mesa that was not even listed on the county website, and that he only found because a retired county sheriff told him about it at a gas station. He walked the rows of machinery with the notebook in his coat pocket, stopping at each machine long enough to read the serial number off the frame. Check the condition of the tires by eye. Listen to the silence inside the engine compartment the way a doctor listens to a chest, and write down what he found. What he found was not what the government appraisers had written down. They had written down mechanical failure, seized engine, non-operational, parts missing. Harlan looked at the same machines and wrote down something different. He wrote down what each problem actually was. Piston seizure from running dry. Wrong injection pump installed by someone who did not know the difference between a 3020 and a 4020 specification. Wiring harness compromised by rodents. Hydraulic line cracked from temperature cycling over 3 winters. These were not unfixable problems. These were problems that had been misread by people who did not know what they were reading. He went back to the lot outside Odessa 4 times before the auction. Each time he stood in front of the 1964 John Deere 4020 in the back corner of the lot and looked at it the way a man looks at something he has already decided about, but is not quite ready to say out loud. The morning of the auction, Roy Keller was there. Roy ran 880 acres of winter wheat on the county road a mile and a half north of Harlan's property. He was 48 years old, built like a hay bale left out in the rain, and he had strong opinions about most things, including the value of government surplus equipment, which in his estimation was approximately what it cost to haul it to the scrapyard minus the hauling. He watched Harlan raise his hand the first time and did not say anything. He watched him raise it the second time and the third. By the 6th time, Roy turned to the man standing next to him, a parts dealer from Andrews named Collins, and said it just loud enough for the people around him to hear. Harlan Briggs just bought himself a pile of problems he cannot pay to fix. The laughter was not mean. It was the particular laughter of practical men watching someone do something they are certain is impractical. Comfortable laughter, the kind that comes from knowing better. Collins shook his head and said he'd heard Harlan lost his job at the dealership. Said he guessed some men took it harder than others. Harlan stood 12 feet away and heard both of them. He did not turn around. He raised his hand a 7th time. He brought the first machine home on a borrowed flatbed that Wednesday afternoon. The 4020, the worst one. 2 pistons welded to the bore from running without coolant through what the cylinder walls told him was the better part of a summer. The injection pump was a 3020 unit, 3 specification points, wrong for the engine displacement. The wiring harness had 11 compromise points, not from age, but from something that had nested in the cab during the winters it sat exposed. Both rear tires were flat to the rim. Roy Keller was in his driveway mending a fence post when the flatbed came down the county road. He stopped working and watched the tractor come off the ramps and into Harlan's equipment shed. He watched it the way a man watches a thing he is already preparing his opinion about. He walked over to the fence line that evening. "Harlan," he said, standing with his forearms on the top rail, "that thing is not worth the trailer you hauled it on." Harlan was on one knee looking at the rear axle housing. He did not look up. Maybe he said. Roy waited for more. There was not more. He walked back to his house. The next 4 months were not dramatic. There was no single moment of revelation. There was only the work, which was the way Harlan had always understood things to get done. He started with the engine because the engine was the center of everything else and because you did not spend time on peripheral systems until you knew whether the central one was worth saving. He pulled the heads first. The damage was exactly what the cylinder walls had suggested. 2 pistons seized to the bore from heat. The 3rd piston cracked across the crown. The 4th intact, but scored. He sourced replacement pistons from a retired parts dealer in Lubbock named Elwood, who had a warehouse of 1960s John Deere inventory that nobody had asked about in a decade, and who seemed almost surprised that anyone was calling. He found a cylinder sleeve in the right specification at a salvage yard in Amarillo. The 4th sleeve he machined himself on a metal lathe he had bought at a bankruptcy auction in Andrews for $320, a purchase that Roy Keller had also witnessed, and also found reason to mention to Collins, the parts dealer. The injection pump took 2 weeks. He pulled the wrong unit, identified it against the spec sheet he had kept from the dealership, sourced a correct replacement from a dealer in San Angelo, who expressed mild astonishment that anyone was still looking for that part, and rebuilt the delivery valves by hand on the workbench in his shed. The wiring harness he replaced entirely, not because tracing 11 fault points through deteriorated insulation was impossible. He could have done it. But a wiring harness you have traced is a wiring harness with 11 places where the repair is only as good as your trace. He did not want that machine going back into a field with 11 places he was not certain about. He wrote everything down, every part number, every torque specification, every clearance measurement from the injection pump timing to the valve lash on each cylinder, every deviation from factory spec he found, and what he did to correct it. He wrote it in June's notebook in the same careful handwriting he had used to fill out service tickets at the dealership for 34 years, except that there were no service tickets now. There was only the notebook and the machine and the shed and the quiet of the county road outside. He went to the salvage yard in Sweetwater for tires. Used agricultural tires, not new but sound. He did not need new tires. He needed tires that would hold air through a planting season, and he could identify those by looking at them, which he did. And he selected 4, which he brought home on the truck bed. The morning he finished a Thursday in late May of 1988, he started the 4020 for the first time. It took 3 cranks. He let it idle for 45 minutes in the shed, with the door open, watching the temperature gauge come up, watching the oil pressure stabilize, listening for the knock. that would tell him a bearing was not seated or a clearance was off. He listened the way he had always listened to engines, not casually, not as background noise, but with the focused attention of a man who understood that a machine tells you everything it is gonna do if you are paying close enough attention when it tells you. There was no knock. There was the sound of a diesel engine doing what a diesel engine is built to do, which is run. He drove it out of the shed and across his property to the back fence line and back again. He checked the hydraulics on the loader arm. He ran it through the gear range. He parked it in front of the shed and sat on the ground next to the front tire and drank a cup of coffee from the thermos he had brought out that morning and listened to the engine cool. Then he went inside and called Roy Keller. Roy answered on the second ring. "I've got a tractor running," Harlan said. "You want to rent it for spring planting. $800 for the season. I fix anything that goes wrong." There was a silence on the line. Roy said he had his own equipment. Harlan said he knew that. Another silence. "What if it breaks down?" Roy said. "I fix it," Harlan said. "That is the arrangement." Roy was quiet for what felt like longer than it was. He was a practical man. He also had 880 acres and a planter that had been giving him trouble on the left wing, and a hydraulic cylinder on his own tractor that he had been watching for 2 seasons and not entirely trusting. He did not want to need what Harlan was offering. He drove over the next morning. He walked around the 402 twice without speaking. He pulled the dipstick and looked at the oil. He checked the hydraulic fluid level. He looked at the tires. He got up in the seat and worked the loader arm through its range and listened to the pump. He got down. "One season," he said. "We will see how it goes." That was how it started. Harlan had 13 more machines to rebuild, and he rebuilt them the same way he rebuilt the first one. Not quickly. Not all at once. One at a time in order of what he could source parts for working through the winter of 1988 and into the spring of 1989, with the shed door open to whatever the weather was doing and the notebook filling up page by page with handwritten records that no one but him could fully interpret, and that he understood the way a man understands a language he has spoken his whole life. By the end of the summer of 1989, he had 7 machines rented to 9 farming operations across Ector and Midland counties. He had not advertised. He had not put a sign on the property. Every arrangement had come through the same channel. One farmer telling another that Harlan Briggs had a tractor that ran, and that Harlan would come out personally if something went wrong, and that he would come out at whatever hour something went wrong, not at whatever hour the dealership service department opened. That last part mattered more than Harlan had anticipated. In the spring of 1989, a man named Chester Flynn, who ran 420 acres of cotton outside Midland, had a hydraulic line fail on the loader at 7 in the evening during a night planning run. He called the dealership where he had bought the machine. He reached a recording that told him business hours were 8 to 5 Monday through Friday. He called the emergency service number listed in his contract paperwork. He reached a different recording. He had heard about Harlan from Roy Keller, who had mentioned him in passing at the co-op with the particular offhand casualness that practical men use when they are recommending something they were initially skeptical of. Chester Flynn called the number Roy had given him. Harlan arrived at 10:15 with the right diameter hydraulic line already cut to approximate length on the truck bed, because the machine Chester was running was a model Harlan had worked on at the dealership, and he knew the loader system well enough to know what size line it used before he left the shed. Chester Flynn rented from Harlan the following spring. He rented for 11 consecutive years after that. By the end of 1989, the notebook had become 2 notebooks, then a filing cabinet that Harlan bought secondhand from an office liquidator in Odessa for $40. Each machine had its own folder. Each folder held the complete service record from the day Harlan had first looked at the machine at auction, through every repair and part replacement, and reported hour of operation since. When a machine came back at the end of a rental season, Harlan inspected it against that record and rebuilt whatever the record and the inspection together told him needed addressing before the machine went back out. This was not how used equipment rental worked. The standard arrangement was that the renter maintained the machine and returned it in roughly the condition it left normal wear accepted. Harlan's arrangement was different, and he had arrived at it not through business theory, but through the same logic he applied to every mechanical system that deferred maintenance is not savings. It is debt. And that debt in a mechanical system collects interest in the form of failure at the worst possible time. He was 50 years old. He had no business plan. He had a filing cabinet and a notebook, and the knowledge that a diesel engine kept properly maintained will run for a very long time, and that the men who needed those engines running were not being well served by the systems that currently existed to serve them. Roy Keller renewed his rental contract for a second season without being asked. He showed up at Harlan's shed in February of 1990 with a check for the season rate and stood at the door and said he had tried the dealership again on a starter problem and waited 9 days for a callback. Harlan said he was sorry to hear that. Roy said he was not asking for sympathy. He was renewing his contract. He renewed it for 17 years after that. He never mentioned the impound lot auction again. He never mentioned what he had said to Collins, the parts dealer, about piles of problems. There was an understanding between them that did not require discussion. The understanding that a man who has been wrong about something in a way that cost him nothing except his certainty does not need to account for it further. He simply stops being wrong and continues. The shed was full by the end of 1989. 12 machines in various states of use or rebuild, with the filing cabinet against the east wall, and the notebook system expanding into a second cabinet that Harlan had bought from the same liquidator for $35 on the last night of the year after the temperature had dropped into the 20s and the wind was moving hard across the flat ground from the northwest. Harlan sat in the shed in his coat with the cabinet drawer open and went through every folder. 43 rental weeks across 9 operations. 11 service calls, all resolved within 4 hours of the call being made. 0 machines that had failed to complete a season in the field. He closed the cabinet drawer and sat with his coffee and looked at the row of machines and thought about what it meant. It meant the work was right. Not the business, not the model. The work. The work was right, and the work was what he understood, and the work was what June would have told him to keep doing, which is the thing he was most certain of, even though she was not there to say it. He opened the last page of the first notebook. Her handwriting was still there at the top. From whenever she had used it last, a list of things that needed doing around the property in the fall. A note about the weather. A measurement she had taken of something in the kitchen he could no longer identify. He had left those pages at the front of the book and started from the back when he took it over, so that her writing and his writing existed in the same book, moving toward each other from opposite ends. They had not met yet. There were still blank pages between them. He closed the notebook and put it back in his coat pocket and sat there for a while longer, listening to the wind come across the flat ground outside and the sound it made against the corrugated steel of the shed wall, which was a sound he had known his whole life, and which meant, in the way that familiar sounds mean things to people who have lived long enough in one place, that the weather was going to hold, and that tomorrow would be a good day to work. He turned off the light and walked back to the house across the frozen ground with his hands in his pockets and the notebook in his coat. 2 miles to the east, in a commercial building on the highway that had been empty for 3 years, a moving crew was unloading office furniture by floodlight. A sign was going up on the exterior wall. The letters were large and professionally installed, and they read, Iron Ridge Equipment Solutions Regional Office, Odessa, Texas. The crew finished just after midnight. They drove away. The sign stayed. Harlan did not know about it yet. He went to bed. He had a machine to finish in the morning. The sign on the highway building faced east, which meant the first thing it caught every morning was the early light coming flat across the Permian Basin. And for the first few weeks of January 1990, that light hit those letters and threw a long shadow across the two-lane road that led, if you followed it far enough north, to the county road that ran past Harlan Briggs's shed. Harlan learned about Iron Ridge Equipment Solutions the way he learned about most things that were not in front of him directly, which was late and from someone else. Roy Keller mentioned it in passing one February morning when he came to drop off the season payment. Said he had seen the trucks going in and out of that building on the highway and had stopped to read the sign. Said it looked like a real operation. Said they had new equipment on the lot, late model machines, GPS capable, the kind with climate-controlled cabs, that the younger operators were starting to ask about. Harlan listened and did not say anything particular. Roy said he supposed it would not affect Harlan much given the kind of machines Harlan was running. Harlan said he supposed not. Roy left. Harlan went back to the shed. Preston Vance arrived in Odessa on the 14th of January 1990 in a company Range Rover with Dallas plates and a leather satchel that contained a market analysis, a regional expansion playbook, and a first-year revenue target that his supervisor in Dallas had described as aggressive but achievable. Vance was 36 years old. He had an MBA from UT Austin and had spent the 4 years before Odessa managing equipment leasing accounts for commercial construction firms in the Dallas-Fort Worth corridor, which was a different business than agricultural rental in ways he had been briefed on, but had not yet experienced. He was tall and kept his hair short, and wore boots that were too clean to have ever been used for anything a boot is actually for. He set up the regional office in 3 days, hired 2 account managers and an office coordinator, and spent the first 2 weeks driving the county roads introducing himself to farming operations across Ector and Midland counties with a rate sheet and a brochure that showed the new equipment on the lot under bright Texas sunlight. He was good at the introduction. He had a firm handshake, and he remembered names, and he knew which questions to ask to make a farmer feel heard. What he did not know, not yet, was what happened after the introduction, which is where the difference between his business and Harlan's business actually lived. He heard about Harlan Briggs from the third farmer he visited, a man named Tucker Cross, who ran 600 acres of grain sorghum outside Midland, and who had been renting a 1966 John Deere 3020 from Harlan for 2 seasons. Tucker told Vance about the arrangement plainly, and without particular advocacy for either side. Said Harlan had older equipment, but that the equipment ran, and that when it did not run, Harlan came out himself, and that he had come out at 2 in the morning once when a fuel line let go during a night run, and had it fixed before sunrise. Vance wrote Harlan's name in his notebook. He drove out to the property on a Wednesday afternoon in late February unannounced. He parked the Range Rover on the gravel apron in front of the shed and walked to the door. The door was open. Harlan was on his back under a 1967 International 656, working on the hydraulic cylinder on the 3-point hitch with a flashlight held between his teeth. Vance waited at the door for what he estimated was 2 minutes before Harlan came out from under the machine. Harlan stood up without particular urgency, wiped his hands on a shop rag that did not improve their cleanliness, and looked at the Range Rover, and then at Vance. Vance introduced himself and explained what Iron Ridge was offering. Said they had newer equipment, better technology, full-service contracts, GPS ready, machines for operators who wanted to move in that direction. Said he understood Harlan had built something here, and that he respected it, and that rather than compete directly, he thought there might be a conversation worth having about a transition. He opened the satchel and took out an envelope and set it on the workbench next to a tray of valve springs. He said there was a check inside for $95,000 representing Iron Ridge's valuation of Harlan's customer relationships and rental agreements, and that Harlan could, of course, continue working as a private mechanic under whatever arrangement suited him. Harlan looked at the envelope. He turned to the filing cabinet against the east wall and opened the second drawer and took out the primary notebook. The first one, June's notebook, and he walked over to the workbench and set it next to the envelope. He opened it to a middle page and held it so that Vance could see the handwriting. The columns of part numbers and clearance measurements and service dates and reported operating hours. The compression readings taken after each rebuild. The notes about each machine's particular behaviors that you could not find in any factory manual, because they were not factory behaviors. They were the accumulated individual characteristics of each specific machine as it had aged. Vance looked at the page. He looked at it the way someone looks at something in a language they do not speak, searching for a point of entry and not finding one. He said, "Those are handwritten notes." Harlan closed the notebook and put it back in his coat pocket. He picked up the envelope and held it out to Vance. Vance took it back. Harlan went back under the International. Vance stood at the door for another moment and then walked back to the Range Rover. He drove to the highway building and sat at his desk and wrote in his report to Dallas that the competitive situation in the county was as follows. One informal operator running aged equipment out of a private shed with no formal service infrastructure, no parts inventory system, no GPS-capable machines, and no apparent interest in scaling or professionalizing. He wrote that the operator had declined an acquisition offer and that the appropriate response was direct market competition, which Iron Ridge was positioned to win on equipment quality, technology, and professional presentation. Dallas wrote back and said to proceed. The spring of 1990 was Iron Ridge's first full season in the market. They ran a rate promotion for new customers, 30% off the first year, and they put the new equipment on the road, and the account managers made their calls, and they signed 14 farming operations across the 2 counties. It was a good start. Vance called Dallas in June and said the region was tracking ahead of the first-year model. What he did not yet know was which 14 operations had signed with Iron Ridge and which ones had not, and what the difference between those 2 groups actually was. The 9 operations that had stayed with Harlan were the ones who had called him at unreasonable hours. They were the ones who had a direct line to a man who knew their specific machine by its specific history and who would be standing in their field with the right part within 3 hours of the call. 2 of the 14 who signed with Iron Ridge had never rented from Harlan at all. The other 12 were operations that had heard the promotion and thought it was worth trying the new equipment. By the end of the 1990 harvest season, 4 of those 12 had called Harlan, not because the Iron Ridge equipment had failed necessarily. One machine had a software fault that required a dealer-certified technician who was available on a 2-week wait during harvest. One had a GPS guidance error that put the rows 3 feet off the intended line, and the damage to that crop section was not recovered. 2 operators had simply called the Iron Ridge service line during a problem and reached a voicemail during the hours when voicemail was what the service line offered. And in the hours between leaving that message and receiving a callback, they had called Roy Keller to ask if he still had Harlan's number. Roy still had it. Those 4 operations came to Harlan in the fall of 1990. He had them look at the filing cabinet. He told them the arrangement was the same as it had always been. They signed seasonal agreements written by hand on a form Harlan had drafted himself 2 paragraphs long, which he kept in a folder in the bottom drawer. Cody Webb first appeared at the edge of Harlan's shed that same autumn. Though appeared is not quite the right word. because a 16-year-old boy standing quietly at the open door of a working shed is not exactly an appearance. He was more of a presence that Harlan noticed in his peripheral vision one October afternoon, while pulling the fuel injectors on a Minneapolis Moline he had acquired at a Midland auction in August. The boy's name was Cody Webb. His father ran 400 acres of dryland cotton on the South County Road, had rented one of Harlan's machines for the past 2 seasons, and had mentioned to Cody more than once that Harlan Briggs was the kind of mechanic you did not find at a dealership anymore. Cody had applied for a junior technician position at the John Deere dealership in Odessa that fall and been told they were not hiring at his experience level, which was a polite way of saying they were not going to train someone from the ground up when they could hire someone already certified on the diagnostic platforms. He had walked the 2 miles from his father's property to Harlan's shed that afternoon without a clear plan. He stood at the door and watched Harlan work. Harlan worked without looking up. After a while, Harlan said, "Either come in or go home." Standing in a doorway does not accomplish much either way. Cody came in. He stood near the workbench and watched the injector work for 20 minutes without speaking. Then he said, "That is a 7/16 socket on the return line, fitting not a 3/8." Harlan stopped. He looked at the fitting. He looked at the socket on the end of the ratchet. He set down the ratchet and reached for the correct size. He worked without comment for another few minutes. Then he said, "Your father's tractor or yours?" Cody said, "My father's, but I am here on my own." Harlan said, "Come back Saturday, 7 in the morning. We will see what you know." That was the only interview. Cody showed up at 6:50 on Saturday and has not been fully absent from the property since. Through 1991 and into 1992, the operation grew the way it had always grown, which was without a plan and without advertising, and without Harlan doing anything differently than he had done from the beginning. The fleet reached 19 machines. He acquired a 1961 International 560 with a cracked head in a Midland auction, and a 1965 Minneapolis Moline G705 that the catalog listed simply as non-operational, and a pair of 1968 Oliver 185Os that had been sitting in a creek-bottom pasture long enough that the frames had surface rust through the paint. He fixed all of them. He wrote everything down. Cody learned by proximity. Harlan did not formally teach. He worked and occasionally said something that explained what he was doing, and occasionally asked Cody a question to find out whether Cody had been paying attention. When Cody answered wrong, Harlan corrected him once and moved on. When Cody answered right, Harlan moved on without comment. The teaching was in the repetition and in the standard, which was that the machine either ran correctly or it did not. And if it did not, the reason was knowable and the fix was findable if you were willing to look carefully enough and long enough. By the fall of 1993, Cody was handling service calls on machines he had worked on himself. He was 20 years old. He drove Harlan's secondary truck with a parts inventory in the bed that he had organized himself, laid out by machine type and system, so that he could find what he needed by feel in the dark. Preston Vance, across those same years, was learning a different set of lessons. Iron Ridge had signed 31 operations across the 2 counties by the end of 1992. The revenue numbers were good. The equipment was newer and capable, and the farmers who had signed multi-year contracts were generally satisfied in the way that people are satisfied with a service that performs adequately during normal conditions. The problem was that farming was not a normal conditions business. The GPS guidance systems on the new equipment were still early generation. The receivers were accurate to approximately 3 meters under good conditions. Cotton row spacing in West Texas runs at 38 to 40 inches. 3 meters of guidance drift does not sound significant, until you are the farmer watching the planter head go through the wrong row on 200 acres of standing crop. 2 Iron Ridge customers filed damage claims in 1992. The claims were resolved, but the resolution took 4 months, and the relationships did not entirely recover. The service infrastructure held during business hours and frayed at the edges of them. The account managers were competent and professional, and available from 8 in the morning until 5 in the afternoon. Farming did not observe those hours. Planting windows open when the soil temperature and the moisture are right, and they close again, and the window does not wait for a service callback scheduled for the following Tuesday. Vance understood this intellectually. He had read about it in the agricultural rental literature and had addressed it in his business plan with a section on after-hours service protocols that specified a 2-hour callback window for emergency situations. What he had not understood, and what the business plan could not have told him, was that the 2-hour callback window began when the call was returned, not when the problem occurred, and that in the gap between those two events, a farmer with a window that was already closing would exhaust every other option available to him. One of those options was Harlan Briggs. Vance drove past Harlan's shed in the spring of 1993 and counted 4 machines he did not recognize on the lot. He asked one of his account managers about it. The account manager said he had heard Harlan had picked up a few new accounts. Said he wasn't sure where they came from. Vance went back to his desk and looked at his customer list. He started making calls. He found 2 of them on the 3rd day. Both had been Iron Ridge customers. Both had called the after-hours line during critical periods. Both had reached the callback system, and while waiting had found another solution. Neither was hostile about it. They were just gone. He wrote a report to Dallas about service infrastructure gaps and requested budget for an expanded after-hours response team. Dallas reviewed the request and approved a smaller version of it. The response team was in place by the fall of 1993. It helped. It was not enough, because the gap between what Iron Ridge offered and what Harlan offered was not ultimately a staffing gap. It was a knowledge gap. The after-hours technician Iron Ridge, dispatched to a breakdown, had the service manual and the diagnostic software, and the company truck with a standardized parts inventory. What he did not have was the folder in Harlan's filing cabinet that told you this specific machine, this exact unit, with its individual history of repairs and wear patterns and operator habits, had shown a similar symptom 18 months ago, and that the cause then had been a particular wear pattern on the governor spring. That the service manual did not flag as a failure mode, because it was not a common failure mode. It was a failure mode specific to this machine because of how it had been used before Harlan acquired it, and what Harlan had and had not replaced during the initial rebuild. The Iron Ridge technician fixed what he could see. Harlan fixed what was going to happen next. The spring of 1994 arrived with the particular ferocity that West Texas springs have when the winter has been dry and the planting window is narrow. And every farmer in the county is watching the moisture levels in the soil and waiting for exactly the right moment, and then trying to put every available machine to work simultaneously the instant that moment arrives. Harlan had 22 machines in the rental fleet by then. On the 7th of April, the 1961 International 560 that Chester Flynn had been running developed a bearing knock in the final drive. Not catastrophic. Not a machine-destroying failure, but the kind of progressive internal wear that a man who had been listening to engines his whole life recognized as something you did not run another season through without addressing. Harlan called Chester at 6 in the morning and told him the machine needed to come in. Chester said he was in the middle of planting. Harlan said he knew that. Chester said he needed 3 more days. Harlan said he could not give him 3 more days on that bearing. Chester was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "All right," and asked if Harlan had something else he could put in the field. Harlan said he was working on it. He called Cody at 6:15. Cody was already in the shed. They went through the fleet together. The 1966 John Deere 3020 that Tucker Cross had been running was showing Governor inconsistency that Harlan had been monitoring not a crisis, but a machine he would not put into a new field without addressing the fuel delivery. The second Oliver 1850 had developed a crack in the rear axle housing that Harlan had found during a routine visual 3 days earlier. That machine was already out of service. He had not told the renter yet because he had been planning to bring a replacement before the call was necessary. 3 machines pulled from service in 11 days during the first week of planting season. He had a 1967 John Deere 4020 in the shed that he had been finishing since February. It was not yet rented. It was going to be. He called Chester first and said he would have something at his property by 9 that morning. Chester said he would believe it when he saw it. Harlan and Cody loaded the rebuilt 4020 on the trailer at 7:30. They drove it to Chester's place and had it off the trailer and in the field by 9:15. The second call was to Tucker Cross. Tucker was calmer about it than Chester had been. He said he had noticed the governor hesitation himself and had been wondering when Harlan was going to say something. He took the alternative machine without discussion and went back to work. The third call was to Gerald Boone. Gerald ran 640 acres of grain sorghum outside Big Spring, and he was the kind of farmer who kept a written record of every hour of downtime he had ever experienced and its associated cost, which he was prepared to recite in detail if the subject arose, which with Gerald it frequently did. He had been renting from Harlan for 4 seasons. He was also in the opening days of his planning window when Harlan called. He did not take the news the way Chester had, or the way Tucker had. He said, "Harlan, I have got 4 days. You understand that. 4 days and then this window closes and I am done until next year." Harlan said he understood. Gerald said he did not think Harlan fully understood because if Harlan fully understood, he would not be calling to tell him a machine was coming out of service on the first morning of the planning window. Harlan did not say anything to that. Gerald said, "I will give you until tomorrow morning. If there is not a machine in my yard by 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, I am calling Iron Ridge." Harlan said, "There will be a machine in your yard by 8 o'clock. He went back to the shed and he and Cody worked through the night. The machine they brought to Gerald Boone's property at 7:45 the following morning was a 1965 Minneapolis Moline G705 that Harlan had acquired the previous fall, and that Cody had been finishing the hydraulic work on for the past 3 weeks. It was not the machine Gerald had been running. It was a different brand, a different configuration, and Gerald stood in his yard and looked at it with the expression of a man who has been told the restaurant is out of what he ordered and has been brought something else entirely. He got on it. He drove it to the field edge and made 1 pass and came back. He looked at Harlan. Harlan looked at him. Gerald Boone drove it back to the field. He ran it for 4 days through the planting window without a single fault. When it was over, he drove it back to the yard and got off and called Harlan and said, "All right," without further explanation, which was Gerald Boone's way of saying what other men said with more words. He rented from Harlan for 9 more years after that. Cody Webb, 21 years old, had worked through that entire stretch without sleep for 31 hours at the peak of it. He had sourced 3 parts from 2 different salvage yards in the dark, driven 140 miles in a single night run, and replaced a hydraulic pump on the Minneapolis Moline in a field driveway by flashlight at 4 in the morning. When it was over, he sat down on the running board of the truck and did not move for a while. Harlan sat next to him on the trailer tongue. After a while, Cody said, "Does it always go like this?" Harlan said no. "Sometimes it is harder." Cody looked at him to see if he was serious. He was serious. Cody nodded. He said all right. He went back to work. Iron Ridge Equipment Solutions held its Odessa Region Customer Appreciation Event in June of 1994 at a steakhouse on the highway. Preston Vance rented the private room and brought in a regional vice president from Dallas, who spoke about the future of precision agriculture and the coming integration of satellite guidance with variable rate application technology and the opportunities that represented for West Texas farming operations. The food was good. The presentation was professional. 14 customers attended. Vance counted the chairs afterward. He knew he had 31 accounts. He knew 14 chairs were filled. He did the rest of the arithmetic without writing it down. The summer of 1995 brought the kind of drought that West Texas produces when it decides to be serious about it. Soil moisture dropped to levels that forced replanting on a third of the county's cotton acreage. The second planting window was narrow and the equipment demand was severe, and the Iron Ridge service line ran at capacity for 6 consecutive weeks. A machine failed at 11:30 on a Thursday night. On a farm outside Andrews, a 60-mile drive from the Odessa office. The after-hours technician drove out and diagnosed a failed hydraulic pump on the 3-point hitch. The pump was not in the truck inventory. It was not in the regional warehouse. It had to be ordered from the distribution center in San Antonio, which meant 2 business days. The farmer had a replanting window of 48 hours. He called Roy Keller at midnight. Roy gave him Harlan's number. Harlan answered on the second ring. He told the farmer what he needed to know, which was that the pump on that model ran 2 specifications, and which specification the farmer needed depended on what year the machine was manufactured. And if the farmer could read him the serial number off the frame, Harlan would know which one it was. The farmer read him the number. Harlan said, "Give me until 6 in the morning." He had the right pump on the shelf. He and Cody drove to Andrews in the dark and had the machine running before sunrise. The farmer signed a rental agreement with Harlan for the following season. He was not hostile about Iron Ridge. He just said, "I cannot afford to wait 2 business days for a pump during planting season," and that Harlan had not waited 2 business days, and that the arithmetic was straightforward. Vance heard about it through his account manager the following week. He went back to his desk and updated the competitive analysis he had been keeping since 1990. The column for Harlan Briggs's estimated customer count now exceeded the column for Iron Ridge's active accounts in Ector County. He called Dallas. Dallas sent a consultant. The consultant spent 2 days in Odessa and then drove out to Harlan's property on the second afternoon. He stood at the shed door the same way Vance had stood 4 years earlier. He looked at the machines in the filing cabinet and the 2 notebooks on the workbench, and he asked Harlan several questions about operational structure and part sourcing methodology and response time guarantees. Harlan answered each question as briefly as it could be answered. The consultant wrote things in a legal pad. At the end, he asked what software Harlan used to manage service scheduling and inventory. Harlan opened the filing cabinet drawer and held it open for a moment without speaking. The consultant looked at the folders. He looked at the handwritten labels on each one. He wrote something in the legal pad. He drove back to Odessa. He filed his report to Dallas. The report said the competitive operator maintains a manual record-keeping system that appears to provide superior predictive maintenance capacity over our current digital service model. Recommend further investigation of knowledge transfer mechanisms. Dallas read the report and said to investigate options for a technology-based solution that could replicate the outcome without the manual overhead. They spent 14 months and $42,000 developing a software protocol for predictive service scheduling. The protocol was based on manufacturer failure rate data and average operating hour thresholds. It was accurate for machines that failed in average ways. It could not account for the specific repair history of a specific machine or the particular operating conditions of a specific farm, or the judgment of a man who had opened the same filing cabinet drawer for 7 years. and knew what he was looking at. The software went live in the spring of 1997. By fall of that year, Iron Ridge had experienced 3 mid-season failures on machines that the software had cleared for continued operation. One of those machines had been flagged by the farmer as running differently than usual 2 weeks before the failure. The farmer had reported it through the customer service line. It had been logged as a non-emergency notation pending the next scheduled service visit. The scheduled service visit was a week after the machine quit in the field. Dr. Sandra Pierce drove to Odessa from College Station in September of 1997 in a 12-year-old Buick that she had owned since graduate school, and that she drove with the particular confidence of someone who has never once considered what other people might think of it. She had spent 7 years studying equipment access barriers in rural Texas farming communities. She had read a USDA report published that summer, which referenced, without naming, an informal equipment rental operation in Ector County that had achieved a machine uptime rate during peak seasonal periods that the report's authors described as statistically anomalous and warranting further study. She had been looking for something like this for 3 years. She pulled into Harlan's gravel apron at 2 in the afternoon. Harlan was not in the shed. He was under a tractor in the back of the lot, with his feet sticking out from under the rear axle, which was how she found him. She said, "Mr. Briggs, I have driven 5 hours to talk to you, so I hope you are not too busy." He rolled out from under the axle and looked up at her from the ground. She told him who she was and what she studied and what she was looking for. She said she had been tracking informal equipment access solutions in rural Texas communities, and that what the USDA report described matched what she had been looking for, so precisely that she had called the report's lead author directly to find out the location, and had been told Ector County, which had taken her approximately 40 minutes to narrow down further. Harlan got up off the ground and wiped his hands. He said, "I fix tractors and rent them out. There is not much to document." Dr. Pierce looked at the shed and the lot and the 2 trucks and the filing cabinet visible through the open door. She said, "That is exactly the point." She spent 4 days at the property that fall. She sat at the kitchen table in the evenings and went through the filing cabinet with Cody's help while Harlan was in the shed. She read the service records. She read the rental agreements. She tracked the parts, sourcing back through 7 years of invoices that Harlan kept in a cardboard box on the bottom shelf of the second cabinet, organized by year and by supplier. She called 6 of Harlan's customers by phone and asked them the same set of questions. On the last evening, she sat with Harlan at the kitchen table after Cody had gone home, and she told him what she had found. She said that across the 9 years of operation, he had served 41 distinct farming operations across 4 counties and had maintained an average machine uptime rate during peak planting and harvest periods of 94.7%. She said the industry average for comparable equipment was 71%. Harlan listened to the numbers. He said it was 43 operations. Cody counted. She said she would correct it. He got up and put his coffee cup in the sink. He said, "I'm going to finish the fuel system on the International before it gets dark. You are welcome to stay for dinner if you want." Cody usually brings something when he comes back in the evening. She stayed for dinner. She published her findings the following spring in the Journal of Agricultural Economics. The paper ran 14 pages and included 6 charts and a methodology section that explained in technical detail how a man with a filing cabinet and a set of notebooks had outperformed a corporate equipment rental operation with a $42,000 software system and a regional staff of 9. It did not use Harlan's name. It identified the operation only by county and operational structure. But Preston Vance read it on a Tuesday morning at his desk in the Odessa office, and he knew. He read it twice. Then he picked up the phone and called Dallas. Dallas told him the Odessa region was being restructured. The decision had been made at the executive level. The regional office would close at the end of the calendar year. The accounts would be transitioned to a centralized service model operating out of the Lubbock hub. Vance sat at his desk for a while after the call ended. Through the window, he could see the highway and beyond it, the flat ground running north toward the county road. He knew which direction Harlan's property was. He had driven that road more times than he could count over the past 7 years. He did not call Harlan. There was nothing to say that the filing cabinet had not already said more clearly than he could. He began drafting the closure notice for the regional accounts. Across town in a shed that had started as 1,200 square feet and now included a second building for the heavier rebuild work, Harlan Briggs was replacing the rear main seal on a 1969 John Deere 4320, working by the light of 2 shop lamps with Cody across from him, handing tools as he asked for them. They had been at it since morning. They would be at it until it was done. The filing cabinet stood against the east wall with 22 drawers now, one for each machine in the fleet. Each folder thicker than the year before. Each page of handwriting. Another entry in the record of what these machines were, and what they had done, and what they were going to need. The notebooks had multiplied. There were 6 of them now, stacked on the shelf above the cabinet, each one filled from back to front so that June's original pages, the list of household tasks. The weather note, the measurement in the kitchen remained at the front of the first book, untouched. Harlan had never written past them. Some things you do not fill in. Some pages you leave exactly as they were. The Iron Ridge sign came down on a Thursday in December of 1997. A crew of 2 men with a rented lift took it off the exterior wall of the highway building in about 40 minutes and loaded it into a flatbed. By noon, the building was empty. By the following week, there was a for-lease sign in the window. Harlan heard about it from Chester Flynn, who had driven past on his way to the feed store and stopped to watch the crew work. Chester called that evening and mentioned it the way you mention something you think the other person probably already knows. Harlan said he had not known. Chester said he supposed that made sense, that Harlan was not the kind of man who kept track of that sort of thing. Harlan said goodnight and hung up and went back to the shed. He did not mark the occasion. He did not feel what you might expect a man to feel when something that had tried to displace him for 7 years folded and disappeared. What he felt, if he felt anything in particular, was closer to the quiet that follows a long noise than to any form of satisfaction. The work had been the answer all along, and the work was still there, and the work was what mattered. He went back to the rear main seal he had not quite finished. The years that followed were the kind that do not make for dramatic telling, but that build the only things worth having, which are things that last. The fleet grew past 25 machines by the end of 1999. Cody Webb turned 26 that year, and had been at the property long enough that the farmers who rented from Harlan thought of him and Harlan as a unit, the way you think of a tool, and the hand that uses it as a single thing, rather than 2 separate things. When a machine needed attention and Harlan was occupied elsewhere, Cody handled it with the same result, which was that the machine ran again and ran soon, and the farmer could go back to work. Harlan watched Cody the way he had watched machines his whole life, looking for what was developing, not what was already there. What he saw developing was something that satisfied him in a way he did not fully examine, because examining it would have required him to think about what came after him, which was a direction his thinking did not naturally go. What he saw was a man who read the filing cabinet the way Harlan read it, who understood that the record was not a log of what had happened, but a map of what was coming, who trusted the handwritten page over the software diagnostic the same way Harlan trusted it, not out of stubbornness, but out of having seen what each one produced when they disagreed. In the spring of 2001, a parts supplier from Lubbock named Harmon Dade drove out to the property to drop off a hydraulic pump and ended up staying 2 hours because he had never seen a used equipment operation that maintained machines the way this one did. He walked the lot and looked at the condition of each machine, and then walked it again. He said, "Harlan, I sell parts to 40 operations between here and Amarillo, and I have never seen a fleet this old run this clean." Harlan said he supposed that depended on what you meant by old. Harmon Dade laughed. He said he supposed it did. He became one of Harlan's primary suppliers and gave him preferred pricing that he had previously reserved for dealerships on the grounds that a customer who knew exactly what he needed and was never wrong about it was worth more than volume. By 2002, Harlan had 28 machines rented to 34 operations. The filing cabinet system had outgrown its original housing and now occupied a purpose-built wooden shelving unit along the full east wall of the main shed. Each machine's folder color-coded by acquisition year. Each folder containing the complete record from the day Harlan had first examined the machine to the most recent service entry. Cody had suggested the color coding in 2000. Harlan had looked at the idea for a long moment and then said, "All right," and let Cody implement it. It was the first organizational change Harlan had accepted since June's notebook. The question of a name had come up several times over the years from Chester Flynn, who said it was strange to write checks to a man's personal name for what was clearly a business from Harmon Dade, who said he needed a business name for his invoicing system from Cody himself, who had mentioned it twice, and both times Harlan had found a reason to change the subject. It came up a third time in the fall of 2003, on an evening when Cody had stayed late to finish the valve work on a John Deere 4440 and had come into the kitchen to wash his hands and found Harlan at the table with the first notebook open in front of him. Harlan had it open to the front to June's pages. He was not reading them. He was just sitting with them the way a man sits with something he is not ready to put away. Cody dried his hands on the kitchen towel and stood at the counter and said, "We should probably give it a name for the tax filings." And Harmon keeps asking. Harlan did not say anything. Cody said, "I think June would have wanted it to have a name." Harlan was quiet for long enough that Cody thought he had made a mistake bringing her into it. Then Harlan said, "Briggs Plains." Just that. No explanation of where it came from or what it meant. It meant what it meant, which was the name of the man who had built it, and the ground it was built on, and nothing more complicated than that. Cody said, "All right." He filed the business registration in Odessa the following week. The name went on the tax forms and on the header of the service agreements, and on the side of the secondary truck, painted by a sign shop on the highway in black letters on white, simple enough that you could read it at distance without effort. It did not go on a sign at the property. Harlan said if a farmer needed a sign to find them by then, they had bigger problems than a sign could solve. Chester Flynn saw the truck on the county road the week after it was painted and pulled alongside at the junction and said through his window that it was about time. Harlan said he was glad Chester approved. Chester said he did not necessarily approve, he just said it was about time, and drove on. That was the full ceremony. The winter of 2006 arrived early and stayed hard. The temperature in Odessa dropped below freezing in November and did not reliably rise above it until March. Harlan ran the shop with the doors shut for the first time in memory, which he disliked because it changed the acoustics and made it harder to hear what the engines were telling him. He was 68 years old, and the cold had begun to reach him in a way it had not when he was younger, settling into his hands and the left side of his back where he had taken a compression fracture in 1979, falling off a loader arm that he should not have been standing on. He did not slow down. He adjusted. He wore a heavier coat in the shed, and he let Cody take the crawler work. The jobs that required getting fully under a machine on the concrete floor. and he concentrated on the bench work and the diagnostic reading and the management of the fleet, which was now 31 machines serving 42 operations. On the 14th of January 2007, a Monday, Harlan was working at the bench on the fuel injection system of a 1971 John Deere 4320 when he became aware of a pressure in his chest. Not pain exactly, more like a presence. The way a hand feels when someone places it flat against your sternum without pushing, just resting there with its full weight. He set down the injector he was holding. He sat on the stool at the bench and waited to see what the pressure would do. It did not go away. It shifted slightly, moved toward his left shoulder, became something that had a direction to it rather than just a location. He had been aware of the possibility of this for years. The cardiologist he had seen in 2004, at the insistence of Chester Flynn, who had found Harlan sitting against the shed wall after a long afternoon and had not liked the color of his face, had told him that his cardiac indicators were in the range that warranted monitoring and that he should pay attention to symptoms. Harlan had paid attention in the way that he paid attention to everything, which was carefully and without panic. He sat on the stool for 12 minutes. Then he walked to the shed door and called for Cody, who was in the second building working on a hydraulic cylinder. Cody came around the corner and looked at Harlan standing in the doorway in his coat and knew immediately that something was different, because Harlan did not call for him unless he needed something specific. And his voice when he called had been different than it usually was. Not louder, not strained, just different. The way a machine sounds different when something inside it has changed. Harlan said, "I need you to drive me to the hospital." Cody said, "I will get the truck." He had it running in 90 seconds. The emergency room physicians at Medical Center Hospital identified a significant myocardial event and admitted Harlan directly. He spent 11 days in the hospital. The cardiologist who managed his case was a careful and direct man named Dr. Hollis, who told Harlan on the third day that the damage to the cardiac muscle was manageable, but that his physical workload required substantial reduction. No more extended periods on his back under machinery. No more lifting components above 40 pounds without assistance. No more 16-hour days during planting season. Harlan listened to all of it. He asked Dr. Hollis if he could still drive. Dr. Hollis said yes, driving was fine. Harlan said, "All right." On the second day Harlan was in the hospital. His phone rang in the shed where he had left it on the workbench. Cody was there finishing the hydraulic cylinder work because the machine was due back to the farmer by the end of the week, and the work did not stop because Harlan was not there to do it, which was something Harlan had told him years ago, and which Cody had taken to mean exactly what it meant. He answered the phone because it might have been a customer. It was not a customer. The man on the line gave his name as Dale Merritt and said he was calling on behalf of a company called AgCore Holdings that was entering the West Texas equipment rental market and was interested in discussing acquisition of the Briggs Plains customer base and asset portfolio. He said they had become aware of the operation through industry contacts and believed there was a mutually beneficial arrangement to be explored. Cody said Mr. Briggs is unavailable at the moment. The man said he understood and asked when Mr. Briggs might be available. Cody said he was not certain. He said he would pass along the message. He finished the hydraulic cylinder. Then he drove to the hospital. He sat in the chair next to Harlan's bed and told him about the call. He described the company name and what the man had said. Harlan listened with his eyes on the ceiling the way he listened to engines without moving, taking in everything. When Cody finished, Harlan was quiet for a moment. He said, "What did you tell him?" Cody said he had told him Mr. Briggs was unavailable. Harlan said, "That is correct." He was quiet again. Then he said, "The first notebook. Where is it?" Cody said it was on the shelf above the filing cabinet where it always was. Harlan said, "Bring it tomorrow." Cody brought it the next morning. He set it on the bedside table. Harlan picked it up and held it, but did not open it. He looked at the cover, which was worn soft at the corners and had a grease stain on the lower right quadrant from 1989 that had never fully come out. He said, "You know how to read it." Cody said he did. Harlan looked at him for a moment with the particular directness he had always used when he wanted to make certain he was being understood rather than just heard. He said, "Then you know everything you need to know." He handed the notebook back. Cody held it and did not say anything. Harlan said, "Call Dr. Hollis. I need to ask him something about the driving restrictions." He came home on the 22nd day against the mild recommendation of Dr. Hollis, who would have preferred one more week of monitoring. Harlan said he had machines that needed his attention and that worrying about them from a hospital bed was not contributing to his cardiac health in any measurable way. Dr. Hollis found this difficult to argue with. The adjustment to the new arrangement was not dramatic. Harlan had always been primarily a thinking man who used his hands to implement what he thought. The physical reduction meant the hands were less in the work, and the thinking was more in the foreground, which changed the texture of the days without changing their fundamental nature. He drove the routes. He sat with the machines and watched Cody work and said what he saw. He managed the filing cabinet and the records. He took the calls. Cody did the floor work and the heavy lifting and the night runs, and after a season of this, he was doing them with a completeness that Harlan recognized the completeness of a man who is no longer approximating someone else's standard, but has arrived at his own, which happened to be the same standard. AgCore Holdings opened an operation in Odessa in the spring of 2008. Dale Merritt, the man who had called the shed the previous January, was not the operator. The operator was a man Harlan had not heard of, but Cody had done some asking around and learned that the money behind AgCore had come partly from Preston Vance, who had left Iron Ridge after the Odessa closure, and had spent the intervening decade in commercial real estate before deciding to return to what he considered to be unfinished business. Harlan received this information on an afternoon in March while sitting in the lawn chair he had begun keeping at the shed door for the purpose of sitting in the sun while watching the lot. He listened to Cody's account without expression. He said, "What are they running?" Cody said they had 8 machines, a mix of late 90s models, nothing newer than 2001. Harlan said, "What service model?" Cody said he had heard they were using a maintenance software package, cloud-based, that was supposed to generate predictive service alerts based on operating hours and manufacturer failure data. Harlan was quiet. He said, "We have heard that before." He got up from the chair and went back to the bench. AgCore ran their first full season in 2008, and by the fall, Cody had heard from 2 sources that they had experienced mid-season failures on machines that their system had rated as low risk for the period. One failure had occurred on a 1999 Case 1H that a farmer had reported as running rough 3 weeks before the breakdown. The report had been logged in the system as a non-critical notation. The machine had seized a hydraulic pump during a critical window in the fall harvest. The farmer had called Briggs Plains the following morning. Cody took the call. He drove out with the correct pump already on the truck because he had spoken to the farmer briefly and identified the machine and pulled its service cross-reference from memory, which was where the contents of the filing cabinet now lived, alongside the paper records, and he had the machine running in 2 hours. The farmer signed with Briggs Plains for the following season. This happened 3 more times in the first 2 years of AgCore's operation, each time in a variation of the same pattern. A machine showed a symptom. The symptom was logged as non-critical by the software. The machine failed at a critical moment. The farmer called Briggs Plains. Cody began keeping a separate record of these events in a notebook of his own, not because Harlan asked him to, but because it seemed like information worth having in a form that could be read later. He used the same format Harlan used: part numbers, dates, symptoms reported and actions taken, what the software had said, and what the machine had actually done. He put it on the shelf above the filing cabinet next to Harlan's notebooks. Harlan saw it there one morning and picked it up and read the first several pages. He set it back on the shelf without saying anything. That evening he said, "Make sure you date the entries from the day the symptom was reported, not the day of the failure." Cody said he already was. Harlan said good. In the fall of 2009, Dr. Sandra Pierce called the shop number and asked if she could bring a group of graduate students to observe the operation. She was teaching a doctoral seminar on rural infrastructure resilience and had been using the 1998 paper as a case study for 11 years, and felt it was time her students saw the actual thing rather than the description of it. Harlan said he would think about it. He thought about it for 2 weeks. Then he called her back and said she could bring 4 students, not a group, and that they were welcome to look at whatever they wanted in the shed and the records room, but that he was not going to stand up and give a presentation, because he did not do that. Dr. Pierce said 4 students was fine. She arrived on a Wednesday in October with 4 doctoral students and introduced them to Harlan in the driveway. Harlan shook each hand once and then pointed them toward the shed and said Cody would show them around. Cody walked them through the fleet and the filing system and the notebooks. He explained the color coding system. He showed them a folder for a machine currently in the field and walked them through the service history from acquisition to the most recent entry. He showed them how to read what the record was predicting against what the machine had most recently reported. One of the students, a young woman who was studying agricultural supply chain resilience, asked what algorithm Harlan had used to develop the predictive maintenance protocol. Cody thought about this. He said he would not call it an algorithm exactly. He said Harlan had looked at machines his whole life, and he understood what they were going to do before they did it. The same way a farmer understands what weather is coming before the forecast says it. He said the system was a way of writing that understanding down, so it did not live only in one person's head. The student wrote in her notebook. Harlan was at the bench on the other side of the shed, doing the valve adjustment on a 1972 John Deere 4320. He was not participating in the tour. At the end of the afternoon, one of the students approached him at the bench and asked if he would be willing to speak at a departmental seminar at Texas A&M in the spring. Harlan said no. The student said Dr. Pierce had asked him to ask. Harlan said to tell Dr. Pierce he appreciated it. The student went back across the shed. After a moment, Harlan put down the feeler gauge and turned and called after the student. He said, "Tell her she can write about it again if she wants." Dr. Pierce published a follow-up study in 2010, comparing the Briggs Plains operational outcomes over the decade from 1998 to 2008 against 3 comparable rural equipment rental operations in the Southern Plains that had adopted software-based maintenance protocols during the same period. The comparison was not close. The uptime differential had held at approximately the same margin, just above 23 percentage points during peak periods. The conclusion of the paper ran to 2 sentences. The first sentence noted that the differential was consistent with the 1998 findings and had not diminished with the maturation of digital maintenance tools. The second sentence noted that the mechanism producing the differential appeared to be not the recording system itself, but the interpretive judgment of the operator applying it, and that this form of judgment did not appear to be transferable through software replication. Agi Core Holdings ceased operations in the Odessa market in the spring of 2011. Dale Merritt called Cody one last time to ask professionally, and without apparent hard feeling, whether Briggs Plains had any interest in acquiring their remaining customer contracts at a reduced rate. Cody said he would ask. He walked out to where Harlan was sitting in the lawn chair, watching a hawk work the field edge south of the lot. He told him about the call. Harlan watched the hawk for a moment. He said, "Call their customers directly. Tell them what we offer. Let them decide on their own." Cody said that will take longer. Harlan said most things worth doing do. He went back to watching the hawk. Cody called AgCor's customers one by one over the following 2 weeks. He did not make a sales pitch. He described the Briggs Plains arrangement the same way Harlan had always described it, which was plainly and without embellishment. He said, "Here is what we run. Here is the maintenance arrangement. Here is the number you call when something goes wrong. And the person on the other end of that number will either answer or call you back within the hour." 7 of AgCor's 9 customers signed with Briggs Plains before the spring planting season. Harlan Briggs died on the 9th of April, 2015, a Thursday, at his kitchen table with Cody sitting across from him. It was not unexpected in the way that the death of a man who has had a significant cardiac event 8 years earlier and has continued to work 6 days a week in a cold shed is not unexpected. And it was entirely unexpected in the way that the death of a person who has been a permanent feature of your understanding of the world is always entirely unexpected, regardless of what you knew in advance. Harlan had said the night before that he wanted to start the 4020 in the morning, the 1964 John Deere 4020, the first machine, the one he had bought for $380 at the March 1988 auction, with its seized pistons and wrong injection pump, and bird-nested wiring had not been in the rental fleet since 2008. In the winter of that year, Harlan and Cody had restored it fully. Not a service rebuild, but a restoration. Remanufactured engine to factory specification. Every hydraulic seal replaced, every line. The paint stripped to bare metal and recoated in the specific shade of John Deere green from the early 1960s. Production years a slightly yellower green than the later formulations which Harlan had mixed by memory and eye. Against a photograph he had found at the bottom of the filing cabinet of a 4020 in working condition dated 1965. They had parked it in the corner of the original shed under a canvas tarp. Harlan started it once a year in March, as close to the anniversary of the auction as he could manage. He let it idle for 45 minutes and listened. It took 3 or 4 cranks every time. It always ran. He had said the evening before, sitting at the table after dinner, that he wanted to start it in the morning because he felt like hearing it. Cody said they would start it in the morning. In the morning, Harlan did not come out of his room at the usual time. Cody was in the kitchen with coffee waiting. After a while, he knocked. There was no answer. He opened the door. He called the ambulance. Then he sat with Harlan until it came. The funeral was on a Saturday 11 days later, at the First Baptist Church on the county road, because that was the church Harlan and June had attended before June died, and that Harlan had attended alone afterward, until the attendance had become irregular, and then had stopped, which the congregation had understood as grief, and had not pressed him on, and which Harlan had never addressed directly, which was consistent with how he addressed most things. 231 people attended. The pews held the farmers and their wives and the grown children of farmers and the widows of men who had run land adjacent to men who had rented from Harlan, and the parts suppliers and the salvage yard operators and the county agricultural extension agent, and 3 people from the Texas A&M department who had driven from College Station because Dr. Pierce had called them when she heard, and they had come without being asked. Roy Keller sat in the 3rd pew on the right side. He was 75 years old and had sold down to 600 acres 4 years earlier, when his knees had made the rest of it impractical, and he had continued renting from Briggs Plains for every one of those 600 acres because there was no arithmetic in the world that made owning your own equipment more sensible than the arrangement Harlan had offered him for 24 consecutive years. He sat with his hands on his knees and his hat on the seat beside him. And he did not cry during the service, not because he was not moved, but because Roy Keller was 75 years old and had grown up in a part of Texas where men of his generation did not cry in church, and some habits were structural. After the service in the parking lot in the April sun that was already carrying the warmth of what was coming, someone asked Roy what he remembered most about Harlan Briggs. Roy was quiet for long enough that the person who asked thought maybe he had not heard. Then he said he answered the phone. He said it simply without drama, looking out at the county road that ran past the church toward Harlan's property. He said 2 in the morning, 3 in the morning, middle of harvest, middle of planting. Whatever was happening on your end, he answered the phone and then he came. That was it. That was all of it. He picked up his hat from the seat he had been holding it against. He walked to his truck. He drove home. Gerald Boone stood at the edge of the parking lot until most of the cars had left. When Chester Flynn walked past on his way out, Gerald stopped him and said, "I want to say something, but I do not know who to say it to." Chester said, "Who do you want to say it to?" Gerald thought about it. He said he supposed he wanted to say it to Harlan. Chester said that was the problem with funerals. Gerald nodded. He drove home and wrote it in a letter that he addressed to Briggs Plains Equipment and mailed that Monday. The letter said that the night Gerald had threatened to call Iron Ridge and Harlan had shown up at 8 in the morning with the Minneapolis Moline on the trailer, Gerald had known he was wrong and that he had never said so, and that he was sorry for that. He said he had run that machine through 4 seasons, and it had not failed once. And that was not luck. And Gerald knew it was not luck. And he should have said so at the time. Cody received the letter on a Wednesday and read it in the shed and put it in a folder in the filing cabinet. Not in any machines folder, but in a new one he labeled Correspondence, which he placed at the front of the first drawer. He kept the operation running. He was 42 years old. He had been at the property for 25 years, and he knew the fleet the way Harlan had known it, not because he had been formally trained, but because training was not the word for what had happened between them. What had happened was that Cody had been present and paying attention for long enough that the knowledge had transferred the only way real knowledge transfers, which is slowly and through practice and through having a man beside you who is not going to tell you you have done something right when you have not. He hired a mechanic in 2018, a 24-year-old from Sweetwater named Nathan Bowen, who had grown up on his family's farm and had applied at 2 dealerships and been told they were fully staffed. Cody hired him for the same reason Harlan had hired Cody, which was that he answered a direct question correctly without being prompted, and then stood quietly and waited. Cody spent the first year with Nathan the same way Harlan had spent the first year with him. He did not teach through instruction. He worked and Nathan watched, and when Nathan was ready to do the work himself, Cody watched and said what he saw. He gave Nathan his own notebook in the spring of the 2nd year. He said, "Write down what the machine tells you before it becomes a problem. Write down the date. Write down what you did about it. Write down what you expected to happen next." Nathan looked at the notebook and said, "Like a journal." Cody said, "Not a journal. A record. A journal is for how you feel about things. This is for what the machine is doing. The machine does not care how you feel about it. It is only going to tell you what it is going to do, and it is only going to tell you once. And you have to have been paying close enough attention to have heard it." Nathan wrote in the notebook that evening. He has written in it every working day since. The fleet stands at 44 machines now. The filing cabinet has expanded into a full records room in the 2nd building, which Cody had a local carpenter frame out. and insulate in 2019 so that the paper did not deteriorate in the West Texas summer heat. Every folder is there. Every machine from the first 14 forward, complete records, legible, dated, cross-referenced. The original notebooks are on a separate shelf in sealed archival boxes that Cody bought from an office supply company in Lubbock. He did not put them there because he thought anyone would ever ask to see them as historical documents, though Dr. Pierce's department has in fact asked twice. He put them there because paper lasts as long as you protect it from heat and light and moisture and neglect, which are the same four things that destroy everything worth preserving, and protecting things worth preserving is a practice he learned from a man who understood it so completely that he never felt the need to say it aloud. The first notebook is in the box at the left end of the top shelf. June's handwriting is still at the front. Harlan's handwriting starts from the back, moving toward her page by page, the record of everything he had done and learned and kept from March of 1988 until the pages ran out and he started the second book. They never met in the middle. There are still blank pages between them. Every March, as close to the original auction date as the schedule allows, Cody goes to the corner of the original shed and pulls back the canvas tarp and sits in the open seat of the 1964 John Deere 4020 and turns the key. It takes 3 cranks, sometimes 4. It always starts. He lets it run for 45 minutes. He does not drive it anywhere. He sits in the seat and listens to the engine the way Harlan taught him to listen. Not as background sound, not as confirmation that everything is fine, but as a language that the machine is speaking, and that a person who has been paying attention long enough can understand. It tells him the same thing it has always told him, which is that a diesel engine kept properly will run for a very long time, and that the man who understood it well enough to keep it running understood something that no software has yet found a way to replicate, and no consultant has found a way to package, and no corporation has found a way to acquire, even when they offered $95,000 for it, in an envelope set on a workbench next to a tray of valve springs on a February afternoon in 1990. The engine idles. The shed is warm from it. Outside, the flat ground runs to the horizon in every direction. The same ground it has always been, patient and indifferent, and exactly as demanding as it has ever been, waiting for the machines to be ready and the men behind them to know what they are doing. Cody sits in the seat. He listens.